Hello there.
You're a feisty little one. Fit him with a restraining bolt.
Meshlimerid gifted a tier 1 sub to Ravalik.
Hi everybody, and welcome back to the Sunday Workshop series. Hold on a second. I'm having some technical difficulties. Yes. For those who might be new here, I'm Meshla. I'm a long-form storyteller and world builder, and tonight we're continuing our craft exploration through steps into the past. Oops, hold on. It's being a pain in the butt. Trying to use the prompter. Nah. I guess I won't today. Let's see. Oh, I went on the front internet on. There we go. I'm Meshla. I'm a long-form storyteller and world builder, and tonight we're continuing our craft exploration through steps into the past, focusing on chapters 17 through 20, which we've already read on stream. Tonight's workshop turns our attention towards something a little quieter, but also more structurally dense: the way that communication systems can live inside a narrative without ever needing to announce themselves. We're not just talking about dialogue or even body language in the broad sense. We're talking about embedded systems of nonverbal communication, signals, haptics, posture, spacing, silence, and all the small choices that can carry operational meaning, emotional meaning, relational meaning, and scene pressure all at once. And one of the central questions beneath all of that is how to do it without losing the reader. Because that balance matters, especially in stories that carry specialized language, doctrine, rituals, or other internal systems. There is always a temptation when we build something intricate to stop and explain it to the reader, to prove the system works, to prove it's clever. But readers don't usually connect to a communication system because it's technically impressive. They connect to it because of what it reveals about the people using it, what it protects, what it conceals, and what it says when speech is no longer enough. That's really the heart of tonight's workshop. So as we move through these chapters, we're going to be looking at how silence can carry pressure, how repeated behaviors become language, and how trust, fear, care, and restraint can all be written into the space between spoken words. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's step into the archives together. Hey Foxy, welcome in this evening. It's good to see you. Oh, I promise I'm not slouching. I swear I'm not. I need water. And yes, Wraith, before you ask, I did put in eye drops this evening. Because I'm going to be staring at my prompter. And you guys by extension. So welcome in everybody. I really do hope that you enjoy the workshop this evening, because honestly, there's a lot going on here, and I have been building the veil code and haptic pulse code for, I don't know, a couple of years. Did I stretch? No, I did not. Alright, you get a free one. Oh, man. I actually needed that because I've been schlepping gear totes all morning, so yeah. Thank you. And for anybody who is curious, I would be happy to share the veil code and haptic pulse lexicon at some point later. It's massive, so consider yourself warned, and it's still evolving. The veil code and haptic pulse systems in these chapters are not functioning merely as tactical shorthand. They're functioning as emotional scaffolding, trust architecture, trauma management, protective behavior, cultural inheritance, and relationship continuity under pressure. That's why the same signal can carry different emotional weight in different scenes. And that matters enormously from a writing perspective. because communication systems in fiction only become believable once they stop feeling like coded gestures and start feeling like something the characters live inside. Something habitual, something embodied, and something old enough that the body reaches for it before conscious thought fully catches up. That's where these scenes become emotionally effective, not in the existence of the signals themselves, but in the fact that the signals emerge naturally from stress, recovery, fear, protection, discipline, and even grief. One of the things that I want to emphasize tonight is that silence is not absence, it's structure, especially in these 4 chapters. The silence between characters is often carrying more information than the spoken dialogue in a scene. And because the veil system is covert first doctrine, much of the communication is intentionally buried inside posture adjustments, gear checks, balance shifts, escort positioning, treatment choreography, corridor spacing, and micro movements that an outside observer would dismiss immediately. That concealment serves 2 purposes simultaneously. Inside the world, it protects the veil, and inside the narrative, it protects immersion, because readers don't feel like the author is pausing the scene to explain the system every few lines. Instead, the communication becomes part of the environment itself, and that environment words are hard. That environmental integration is one of the most important craft lessons in these chapters. Yeah, about that. Give me 1 second, I gotta check something. Oh, here we go. Alright. Another thing that we'll be focusing on tonight is emotional continuity. You may have heard me talk about that a few times before, because one of the easiest mistakes that writers can make with specialized communication systems like the Veil Code or the haptic pulse doctrine is assuming that signals function like static dictionary definitions. I will admit that that's kind of how they were functioning initially, and I actually went back in and started looking at the context of the scene and what was actually going on around the different signals and said, you know, this signal technically means this right here, but it could also mean this. And I didn't want to make a new signal that meant essentially the same thing with a different context. Right? You'll understand what I mean later. But real communication never really works that way. The meaning of a gesture changes depending on timing, the relationship, the physical state of the people in the scene, the surrounding danger, prior emotional context, and who is receiving it. A hand on a shoulder can mean reassurance, warning, restraint, grief, authority, apology, or even farewell. The emotion itself doesn't carry the full meaning. Context does. And the Veil Code operates the same way. For example, a containment signal used during active threat management doesn't emotionally land the same way when used during medical stabilization, even if the operational meaning remains similar, as I just talked about. That emotional flexibility is what keeps the system human. Without it, the signals become mechanical, and mechanical systems rarely sustain emotional tension on their own. Yeah, I'm really... You guys may notice, because... And this is specifically because we have read these chapters before getting to this workshop. So if you were here during those storytime streams, you'll see what I mean. Sorry. Tonight's chapters are particularly interesting because they show the Veil system functioning across multiple emotional states: preparation, suppression, containment, extraction, recovery, escort, grief, and a protective watch behavior. There we go. The same doctrine exists throughout all of those. But if the emotional temperature can change constantly, and the writing adapts accordingly. That adaptability is one of the reasons that the system remains readable instead of overwhelming to the reader, but also to me. Trust me, I'm the one that's building this thing, and I was having a moment the other night because I realized what was going on and went, oh, I should probably fix that. And of course I realized this after I read the chapters to you guys, so it's a thing. We're also going to talk about something very important for writers building any kind of specialized narrative system: reader trust. Because readers don't need to consciously decode every signal for the scene to work. They only really need emotional clarity, behavior consistency, and contextual grounding. That's really it. If the reader understands these people are protecting her, or something dangerous just shifted, or even this room tightened without anyone speaking, then the system is working. You don't need readers to memorize terminology for tension to function in a scene. In fact, over-explaining often weakens tension because it moves the attention away from the emotional movement and towards technical parsing. If you were here the last 4 chapters that I was reading, you will totally understand what I just said, but we'll get there. These chapters avoid that by prioritizing scene momentum, emotional framing, and behavioral readability first and doctrine second. That order matters. And finally, I want to acknowledge something before we move deeper into the material tonight. A lot of these scenes deal with silence under pressure, with people communicating when... Oops. Alright, hold on. It scrolled up way too fast. Hold on. Okay. With people communicating when speech becomes unsafe, impossible, or emotionally insufficient, that can resonate differently for different people, especially for writers who are processing burnout, grief, chronic stress, caregiving fatigue, trauma recovery, or emotional isolation. How many of you deal with chronic stress and burnout? Me? I'm just gonna stick my hand up. That's the thing. So if anything tonight feels heavy, please take care of yourselves first. That's the most important thing. You don't need to absorb every piece of this analysis. You don't need to perform understanding. You can simply listen or just rest. That's okay. The archives are built for that too. That's really the whole purpose that they exist for. Tonight, we're going to move scene by scene through chapters 17 through 20, not to decode every signal mechanically, but to explore why these systems work narratively, how silence can carry pressure, how emotional context can reshape the meaning of a signal, and how specialized communication can deepen intimacy, dread, and even trust without collapsing readability. As we move into tonight's workshop, you might quietly consider this. If you're a writer yourself, a DM, or any kind of aspiring creative, what kind of communication already exists in your writing that are not spoken aloud? That could mean different things for different people depending on your context and your focus. Hi, Lord. Welcome in. It's good to see you. Tonight's primary case study is unusual because we are not examining a single emotional arc. We're examining a communication ecosystem. And ecosystems like this behave differently than individual moments. They evolve, they adapt, they reinforce pressure over time. But most importantly, they create continuity between scenes that otherwise might feel emotionally disconnected. That continuity is one of the reasons chapters 17 through 20 feel so cohesive now, despite their earlier versions, and despite dramatic shifts in location, danger level, pacing, physical state of the characters, and narrative focus. The Veil system acts as connective tissue, not only tactically, but emotionally as well. I don't think that's the name of the chapter. Hold on. It's not. It is not. Of course it's not. No, that's the scene name. So, chapter 17's title is Before the Fall. Sorry. The scene name is called Stripped of Name. Identity compression through silence. We begin in the armory, and immediately the room itself establishes one of the most important principles of Veil communication. The silence is already structured before the first signal even appears. The armory is described with extraordinary intentionality. Ordered gear, controlled lighting, precise placement, disciplined quiet. Nothing is chaotic. Nothing spills outward emotionally. And that matters because Veil systems require environmental discipline in order to feel believable. A covert communication system cannot exist inside a narratively noisy environment. The scene itself must learn restraint first. One of the strongest lines in the opening section is, "Even the silence felt arranged around the work." That line quietly teaches the reader how to interpret the rest of the chapter. Not everything important will be spoken aloud, and not everything important will even be directly acknowledged. Meaning exists in arrangement, positioning, absence, and microadjustment. That becomes foundational for everything that follows. Give me 1 second. The first major Veil signal in the chapter appears not during combat, but instead during grief management. Ethan's subtle motion. His thumb brushed once across the knuckles of his closed hand while his chin angled a fraction away before settling again. Followed by name denial. Leave nothing that ties the mission back to who you are. What matters here is not the signal itself. It's the emotional layering surrounding it, because operationally the signal is simple. Strip identifiers. But emotionally, the signal becomes acknowledgement of the erasure, acknowledgement of Marin's sacrifice, acknowledgement of grief, and acknowledgement of identity suppression, and crucially, Ethan performs the signal before speaking aloud. That ordering matters. The body communicates first, the spoken words follow afterward. This creates the feeling that the doctrine exists beneath speech rather than alongside it. Which makes... Oh, sorry. There we go. Oh, here. Which makes the system feel older than it actually is. Sorry. More lived in and more instinctive. Notice also that the narration doesn't stop to over-explain the signal mechanically. The scene provides execution, meaning of the signal, the emotional consequences, and then it immediately returns to the narrative. That pacing discipline is essential. Writers often damage their own immersion by treating every specialized communication cue like a glossary entry. I was doing that, okay? I will freely admit that. I will freely admit that. But here, the signal behaves like dialogue actually would. It's briefly interpreted and then emotionally absorbed into the overall scene. That keeps the tension moving. Another important detail, the signals rarely interrupt physical activity. Jared continues adjusting equipment. Marin continues packing. Ethan continues observing posture and spacing. The communication exists inside the motion. That's one of the strongest anchors of realism in the entire Veil system, because trained communication systems become habitual precisely by integrating into ordinary movement patterns. Okay. There we go. Oh, sorry. Then we reach one of the most important emotional pivots in the chapter. Well, in the scene. The memorial braid. Baron touches it. She hesitates. She's trying to decide whether she still has the right to carry it. Oh, goodness. Sorry. And the room tightens around that gesture. Not through dramatic reaction, but through restraint. This is where silence becomes pressure architecture. Nobody argues with her. Nobody protests. And nobody delivers a big speech. Instead, tiny shifts occur. And those shifts become emotionally devastating precisely because they remain controlled. This is a critical lesson for writers handling non-verbal systems. The quieter the environment, the more weight that tiny movements can actually carry. If every scene is emotionally loud, micro-positioning can disappear. But if the narrative teaches the readers to watch carefully, even a paused hand, a shifted shoulder, or a delayed breath can carry enormous tension. The stay sharp signal later in the scene works similarly. Operationally, it's heightened awareness. Emotionally, it's protective fear. Ethan is not merely giving Marin tactical instruction, he's trying to keep her alive. And because the signal is embedded beneath touch, a hand settling onto her shoulder, the emotional meaning becomes inseparable from the operational meaning. That fusion is why the system remains emotionally resident instead of clinical. We have an ad starting in just under 3 minutes, my friends. 2. Shadows in Transit. Environmental silence as tactical narrative. The transition to the landing pad scene expands the Veil system outward into group choreography. Now, the silence is no longer intimate, it becomes procedural. The pre-dawn setting matters enormously. There's fog, muted perimeter relays, a cloaked shuttle with no running lights, controlled pacing. Everything reinforces concealment, but notice that the scene never feels sterile, because emotional tension continues underneath the operational structure. One of the strongest craft choices here is pacing. Nobody rushes. The narration explicitly states the pace itself was part of the disguise. That's deeply important for writers attempting tension through silence. Stillness isn't the absence of urgency. Sometimes stillness is how trained people survive that urgency. That distinction can transform the emotional texture of the scene. Greer's use of veil advance is another excellent example of embedded communication. The gesture is low and subtle, integrated into movements. And, whoops, hold on. Prompter's being a pain. Okay. Okay. Again, the signal is almost invisible. And because the scene frames Greer through observational discipline, such as wind direction, perimeter visibility, and extraction geometry, the signal feels like an extension of cognition itself. One of the most sophisticated things that these chapters do is maintain multiple simultaneous communication layers. There's a spoken layer, operational clarity, the veil communication layer, covert tactical meanings, emotions, fear, protection, grief, and trust, and then there's the force. Especially between Marin and Jared, these layers overlap constantly without collapsing into confusion because each one serves a different narrative purpose. That separation is extremely difficult to maintain cleanly, trust me. I probably revised these chapters, at least 3 times. I'm not gonna lie. It's a lot. I think we're about to be in an ad. I will be right back, my friends. Welcome back from the ads, my friends. Wow, I can English today. There we go. For example, Jared barely speaks in either scene, but emotionally his presence is actually enormous. The Force becomes yet another form of nonverbal communication. It communicates calm, warmth, refusal, reassurance. Again, communication before dialogue. The thematic consistency is one of the reasons the workshop arc between workshop 6, 7, and 8 feels pretty cohesive. Then we get one of the most important signal principles in the entire system. Signals can reinforce environment rather than interrupt it. When Greer signals stay sharp, the shuttle is descending, the world remains in motion. The signal becomes part of the atmospheric tightening rather than pausing it. That is exactly how writers should think about embedded systems, not as informational interruptions in the scene, but as environmental currents. Sorry, I apologize. The prompter's being a bit, weird. Because I just dumped a giant file into it for stream. So, if you notice me having issues with that, that's probably why. You don't want to know how long that file is. 3. Chapter 18, and the scene is Chains of Static Silence. Silence under captivity. Now the system changes completely because Marin is isolated, and isolation can fundamentally alter communication dynamics. One of the most important craft decisions in Chapter 18 that I use is that veil communication largely disappears externally, but it survives internally. That distinction matters. Marin has been stripped of her support structure, her squad, her force stability, and her operational continuity, along with her physical freedom. But discipline remains, pattern remains, and most importantly, her mental structure remains. The chapter repeatedly uses breath counting, pain compartmentalization, memory anchors, and internalized instruction as substitutes for active veil exchange. That's honestly a brilliant structural continuity, because it shows that doctrine has already become psychologically embedded. The communication system survives even when no one else is around. Ethan's remembered instruction, pain is a moment, do not let them own it, functions almost like a phantom signal. It stabilizes Marin's identity, it restores her rhythm, and it reasserts her internal control. This is critical for writers. Specialized communication systems can become emotionally powerful once they continue affecting scenes, even in their absence. That's when they stop feeling decorative. Ooh. Sorry, I have fingerprints everywhere. I gotta be able to read. There we go. Okay. Another major craft point here. The Chiss operative that confronts Marin actually speaks very little, and that restraint creates immense pressure because silence itself becomes dominance. Every pause carries assessment. Every movement carries intention. This mirrors veil discipline structurally, but weaponizes it differently, which creates an extremely effective thematic inversion. The line, the silence around her never fully settled, is especially important because the silence is now hostile. Earlier scenes used silence as protection, structure, continuity, and now silence becomes something different entirely. It's suffocation, uncertainty, and containment, and the same absence of speech. It has a completely different emotional effect on Marin. That contextual shift is exactly what sophisticated nonverbal writing requires. The final line, because silence doesn't mean surrender, becomes the thematic hinge of the entire workshop. because the veil system itself is built on that very idea. Silence isn't passivity, and it is instead intent under restraint. 4. Chapter 19, The Edge of Silence. I believe that is the scene title. One second. Yes, that is the title of the very first scene. I had to double check myself. Veil systems under active pressure. Chapter 19 is where the doctrine system fully activates operationally, and importantly, the signals accelerate pacing rather than slowing it down. And let me tell you, that's extremely difficult to write well, because action scenes with embedded communication systems can easily become unreadable. Yes, this actually happens. The solution used here, after a couple of rewrites, is elegant. Signals are tied to spatial geometry, lane control, body positioning, and protection assignments rather than abstract information dumps. This keeps the readers physically oriented. For example, split advance and mirror receive are not merely tactical instructions. They create corridor shape. The readers understand that lanes are forming, space is narrowing, the containment is controlled, and protection is being layered. Even if they never memorize the signal names themselves. That's honestly excellent narrative design. And I should know, because it took me about 4 tries to get it right. And then we reach one of the most emotionally devastating lines in the... Ooh, hold on. It's... Hold on 1 second. There we go. And then we reach one of the most emotionally devastating lines in the chapter. They were not rescuing her. They were walking her home. That line transforms the entire veil system emotionally. Suddenly, the positioning, the escort choreography, the coverage assignments all become quiet acts of care and not merely tactical responses. That emotional reframing is why the signals remain human and, in my opinion, why they actually work. 5. Chapter 20. Escort Ritual and Recovery Silence. Chapter 20 slows everything down. Again, kind of like it was in Chapter 17. And this change of pace is actually essential, because without this decompression, the continuous tension becomes emotionally flattening. The escort scenes are almost ritualized. Signals now function as mourning continuity, protective continuity, and recovery oversight, and sealed grief discipline. The movement becomes almost ceremonial, and because the signals remain subtle, the restraint preserves the dignity throughout the scene. One of the important craft principles here is this. The veil system never becomes spectacle, even during the emotionally charged moments. That restraint helps preserve credibility, and it preserves emotional intimacy. The line, "Emberlock tolerated no cracks in its armor," perfectly encapsulates the emotional cost of the system. Because the discipline protects people, but it also requires suppression. And that tension gives the doctrine humanity. Without that personal cost, that human cost, the system would feel emotionally flat. As we read through these chapters, you might quietly think and consider this. When your character stops speaking aloud, what begins communicating for them instead? I mean, to be honest, this whole system came about because of what was going on in these chapters. I wanted a way for these characters to communicate in areas that might be compromised, militarily or otherwise. All right. Whew. Part 3. Secondary examples. Now that we've moved through the primary case study, I want to widen our lens a little bit. Because one of the reasons that the Veil Code system works in chapter 17 through 20 specifically is that it doesn't feel newly invented for those chapters. It's actually been worked on for a while. It feels inherited and practiced and repeated across years. And that feeling, the feeling that the system existed before the reader arrived, is one of the most important qualities any specialized communication structure can have. A believable communication system is never just vocabulary or signals. It's culture, it's habit, and its emotional history embedded into movement. And tonight's secondary examples are going to focus on how the story builds on that feeling across the wider arc, not just through exposition dumps, but through repetition, variation, and contextual adaptation. You'll notice this as we go through some of this, because there's a couple of signals or where there's 2 or 3 variations depending on what's going on and how it's being used. 1. Repetition without redundancy. One of the easiest mistakes writers make with coded communication systems is assuming repetition automatically becomes boring. But repetition is actually what makes systems believable. The problem isn't the repetition itself. The problem isn't the repetition itself, it's static repetition. The Veil system avoids this by allowing the emotional temperature around repeated signals to change. That distinction is critical. I'm gonna check something real quick. Aha, there we go. I think I fixed it. Okay. Sorry, I was adjusting something on the prompter. Take kesarim, for example. This is something that I have actually used a few times. Operationally, its core meaning remains relatively stable. Stand down, hold steady, release strain, and it's often used in recovery oversight. But emotionally, it changes dramatically depending on the scene context. In one scene, it functions almost like a quiet dismissal after a watch rotation. In another, reassurance but in a recovery area, and another, permission to stop carrying visible tension for the moment. It's all the same signal, but it has different emotional gravity. This mirrors how real human communication actually works. Even ordinary phrases change meaning depending on our tone, our exhaustion level, the danger that might be around us, our relationship to the people we're speaking to, and the timing. No problem can mean genuine reassurance, emotional suppression, passive frustration, exhaustion, affection, or resignation. Context reshapes language constantly, and Veil Code becomes believable precisely because it behaves the same way. Yeah, trust me, this you might begin to wonder if I'm still sane. Maybe. Hopefully not, though. 2. Micro-positioning as emotional narrative. One of the strongest elements across these chapters is the use of spatial arrangement as communication. Not just the hand signals, not just the haptic pulses. Positioning itself communicates things constantly. Who stands closest? Who watches the exits? Who remains behind Marin, and who physically blocks sightlines? And who faces inward versus outward? All of these choices create emotional meaning before dialogue even begins. And importantly, The reader doesn't need tactical expertise to understand it, because humans instinctively read positioning behavior. We recognize guarding, shielding, surveillance, exclusion, containment, reassurance almost immediately. That instinctive readability is why micro-positioning is such a powerful narrative tool. For example, Greer repeatedly positions himself at transitional thresholds, shuttle ramps, hatchways, medbay entrances, corridor bottlenecks. Operationally, he's controlling the flow, but emotionally, he's absorbing the pressure before it reaches the others. This is one of the most sophisticated forms of nonverbal characterization, behavior geography. Where a character stands becomes part of who they are. Jared's positioning works differently. He tends to remain close enough to stabilize, distant enough not to overwhelm, and aligned beside rather than directly in front of Marin. That creates an entirely different emotional texture, presence without intrusion. And again, the body communicates before the dialogue does. Alright. I'm stretching. I was slouching. Alright. Haptic pulses. Invisible emotional architecture. The haptic pulse system is especially interesting because readers almost never fully see it. They experience its effects indirectly, and honestly, that's why it works. For those who are curious, the haptic pulse system is essentially Morse code, right? I'm just gonna put that out there, so so you know what's going on. If every pulse sequence was fully decoded every time, the scenes would collapse under explanatory weight. Instead, the narrative prioritizes emotional outcomes, pacing, behavioral responses. The readers understand something passed between them. That's often enough. This is a very important lesson for writers. Building specialized systems, trust me, this is why I went back over it about 3 times. Because it was too clinical, too technical, and I wanted it to be more kind of related to what was going on in the scene. Readers don't need complete informational access to feel emotional clarity. In fact, partial opacity often strengthens the immersion because it mimics how outsiders experience real embedded systems. Think about military jargon, medical shorthand, dance notations, sports communication. Think about the signals they use in football. Sign language, emergency response codes, Morse code, anybody? Yeah. Observers rarely understand every element immediately, but they understand the urgency, the coordination, the emotion, and the hierarchy. And these narrative systems should often function similarly. The haptic pulse system also creates something extremely valuable structurally: silent pacing control. A haptic alert can tighten a room instantly, redirect attention, create escalation, and shift emotional rhythm without interrupting the flow of dialogue. That's extraordinarily useful in scenes where spoken interruption would break immersion or the tension in a scene. I mean, how many times have you been in a place where you can't really say what you're thinking aloud, but you're communicating with your friend through body language and expression? It's kind of the same thing, right? 4. Veil code as relationship language. One of the reasons these systems remain emotionally engaging is that they become relationship specific over time. Different characters use the same doctrine differently, and that creates nuance that matters enormously. Rare signals tend to be economical, stabilizing, structurally protective. Ethans often carry layered emotional restraint, warning beneath calm, and grief compression, Jared's interactions with silence are different. They're receptive, observational, and grounding. Even before specific signals appear, their behavioral rhythms distinguish them. This is essential when writing specialized communication systems. Without character variation, everyone begins sounding or signaling the same way. And once that happens, the system loses emotional individuality. The doctrine remains standardized, the emotional delivery does not. And that balance is what creates the realism. This is why I went back over these chapters like 3 or 4 times, because it was too emotionally flat. And if you're a writer, you will understand. Alright. Yes, having a scene be emotionally flat is boring. Hey Joe, what are you doing? Welcome in, sir. I see you lurking. Alright. He's subscribed again. Thank you very much. You didn't have to do that. The danger of over decoding. Now, I just want to pause briefly on something important, because there's a temptation, especially for world builders like myself, to explain everything. Every signal, every haptic pulse, every gesture, but total transparency often weakens these narrative systems. Mystery creates texture, partial understanding helps create immersion. Readers enjoy feeling, I understand enough to follow this emotionally. They don't necessarily need, I can academically decode every gesture. Those are two very different experiences. And Workshop 8 works specifically because the scenes prioritize emotional orientation, spatial orientation, relational orientation before doctrine explanation. The Veil system trusts the reader. That trust is one of the reasons the silence feels tense rather than confusing. We have an ad starting in just under 4 minutes. Yeah. 6. Silence as escalation. Another fascinating pattern across these chapters is that silence itself becomes a form of escalation, especially in chapters 18 through 20. Earlier, silence often represented recovery, stillness, reflection, and now silence means active suppression, operational containment, emotional overload, protective discipline, imminent danger. It's the same atmospheric tool with different narrative pressure. That contextual evolution is what keeps the silence from becoming repetitive. Writers sometimes think that tension escalation requires bigger action scenes, louder conflict, and faster pacing, but these chapters demonstrate another method. Silence becomes more structured and more deliberate and more compressed, and the reader feels this escalation through tightening behavior control. And honestly, that's pretty sophisticated pacing. 7. Emotional continuity across workshops 6 to 8. Oop, hold on. There we go. One of the reasons this workshop sequence flows so naturally is because the craft layers build on each other. Workshop 6 focused on rising dread through environmental pressure. Workshop 7 focused on identity compression and survival under erasure. And Workshop 8 focuses on communication systems functioning beneath speech under that same pressure. These are not separate techniques. They are interlocking systems. And that's another important lesson for writers. The strongest emotional narratives rarely rely on one craft layer alone. They emerge from multiple subtle systems reinforcing one another simultaneously. What behaviors or positioning patterns repeat between your characters often enough that they've started becoming a language of their own? Yep. Yeah. Veil code and haptic pulse code became a thing because it was necessary. It's just kind of taken on a life of its own. We have an ad starting in about a minute. So I'm gonna actually pause with what I'm reading through, and please feel free to ask questions in the chat. If I know that I've been kind of working through a lot, so if you have any questions, I'm also doing that too. Yeah. Yeah, so if Wraith has an excellent point. So if you are writing a story or DMing a RPG or anything like that where you're having to create a language, any kind of communication system, like a spoken language, a signal language like I'm building, or even something like oh goodness, the memorial braids that are a thing in Katani culture, they kind of have a language of their own. So yeah. I'll talk a little bit about that after we get back from our ad. Alright, my friends, we are back from our ad break. I hope you all took that opportunity to get some water, grab a snack, take a stretch, as my mods are so fond of reminding me, because that's why they're there. You can feel free to use all of the commands within reason. But yes, as I was saying before we got so really interrupted by the ad break, I have I have a spoken language that I'm working on. I have the Veil code and haptic pulse code that I've been building, and there's also other kind of non-verbal languages that I've been kind of working on. So if any of you have been here a while, you may remember that Marin has a braid that she wears behind her left ear. It's not the Padawan braid, it's a memorial braid. And there's a whole thing about like what the different colors of the thread mean and what the different like the different charms mean that you can put into it, like beads or stone or things like that. There's a whole thing about what all of that means and potentially could mean given the individual context. So maybe I'll do a workshop about that later. We'll find out. Because that could go... I could probably go for a couple hours on that, too. Okay. Alright. Here we go. Part 4. Applied craft. This is the part where we can talk about how this all works in a story for you guys. Building nonverbal communication systems without losing the reader, because that's a concern. So this is the practical side of the workshop, not just why it works, but oh, hold on. But how to build something similar in your own writing without overwhelming pacing, clarity, or emotional continuity. And honestly, this is one of the hardest balancing acts in narrative design. Trust me, this is why I've been over these chapters 4 times. Because specialized communication systems are extremely easy to overbuild, especially for world builders like me. And for writers who generally enjoy creating systems like this. The danger is that the system becomes more visible than the story itself, which actually happened. When that happens, the scenes actually can slow down, the emotional tension in the scenes collapses, and the readers can start studying the mechanics instead of experiencing the narrative. So, tonight's applied craft segment is really about one core principle. Communication systems should support emotional flow instead of interrupting it. Everything else branches from that. 1. Start with human behavior, not code. One of the biggest mistakes that writers make is beginning with terminology, signal dictionaries, organizational structures, and technical complexity before they even understand how the characters emotionally communicate. But believable systems don't begin mechanically. They begin through behavior. The reason the Veil Code feels so convincing is because most of the gestures are rooted in recognizable human behavior. Adjusting gloves, redistributing weight, brushing grit from gear, checking spacing, easing tension from the hands, touching a wrist, shifting stance. These are all plausible motions even without doctrinal meaning. That plausibility is what matters, because covert communication systems survive by hiding inside ordinary behaviors. And narratively, that concealment prevents scenes from feeling theatrical. So when building your own systems, ask yourself, what would these characters already be doing physically under stress? Start with that. Then layer meaning into those actions, not the other way around, because honestly, that's what I was doing. So, yeah, don't do that. So start with what your characters are doing and build from there. 2. Design for emotional flexibility. Another key lesson from the Veil code system. The signals should not behave like rigid translation software, because that's what they were doing initially. Okay? I'm not gonna lie. Real communication has context, and emotional systems especially require flexibility. For example, a containment signal in combat, medical stabilization, grief processing, escort movement, or recovery oversight will emotionally land different every time. The operational meaning may remain stable. The emotional resonance is what actually changes, and that flexibility is what keeps the system alive. If signals only ever mean one thing emotionally, they start to feel robotic, predictable, and flat, which is what I was running into. So when designing communication systems, think in layers. Remember how we were talking about onions last time? We're back to our onion analogy. Operational meaning. What information is being conveyed? Emotional meaning. What emotional state surrounds this communication? Relational meaning. Who's sending it? Who's receiving it? What history exists between these people? And, of course, there's environmental meaning. What does the surrounding atmosphere do to the signal that is being communicated? Those layers working together create complexity without needing extra exposition. Yes, we're using the onion analogy again, because it works.
Feisty little one. Fit him with a
Oh my goodness. Hey, Joe. Thank you for that gifted sub to Sea Doodle. Thank you. She wanders by occasionally, so I appreciate that. Thank you. Alright. 3. The reader doesn't need full fluency. This is probably the single most important thing that I can share with you tonight. Readers don't need to fully decode your system in order for it to work. They need emotional orientation, contextual consistency, behavioral readability. That's honestly enough. In fact, partial opacity often strengthens the immersion, because real-world embedded systems function very much the same. If you walk into a hospital, a military operation, a dance rehearsal, an emergency response scene, you won't understand every shorthand exchange, but you will understand the urgency, the hierarchy, the coordination, and the emotion. Narrative systems should often function the same way, so resist the urge to explain every signal, especially in the middle of a scene. Over-explanation can kill your pacing faster than almost anything else in system-heavy writing. Here's a good rule of thumb. If the emotional meaning is already clear from behavior and scene pressure, you probably don't need additional explanation. That's one other thing that I was running into. So I'm not gonna lie, I spent a few days reworking scenes. Alright. And I'm gonna stretch before Wraith yells at me. Ooh. Okay. Alright. 4. Use repetition strategically. Repetition creates credibility, but variation is what creates life. You really need both in a scene. If signals never repeat, the system feels random. If signals repeat identically every time, the system begins to feel mechanical. That balance comes from stable operational structure and evolving emotional context. This is exactly why Keserim works so well across multiple scenes. The reader gradually learns the signal means safety, steadiness, and release from strain. but the emotional tone evolves depending on exhaustion, grief, watch rotations, recovery oversight, or companion reassurance. That evolution creates the emotional layering in a scene. And importantly, the repetition also trains the reader. Over time, the readers stop consciously decoding every signal. They begin feeling what the signals mean instinctively. And that transition is when your system becomes immersive, which is what I'm honestly aiming for. mm. Mm. 5. Spatial communication is often more powerful than any hand signal. A lot of writers focus heavily on gesture systems, but honestly, positioning usually carries more emotional clarity than the signals themselves. Who moves first? Who blocks the doorway? And who stands nearest to the injured person? Who watches outward instead of inward? Who physically closes distance? These things communicate immediately and often more effectively than any named gestures. And because your readers instinctively understand spatial relationships, micro-positioning becomes an incredibly powerful narrative shorthand, especially under tension. One of the strongest recurring patterns in chapters 17 to 20 is corridor shaping. The Marines repeatedly create lanes, buffers, escort geometry, and visual shielding, and even when the readers don't consciously map every position, they still feel protection, tightening, and containment. That is excellent nonverbal storytelling. Rage Out might understand some of what I'm talking about. 6. Silence requires environmental support. Silence alone is not automatically tense. This is important. A silent scene without environmental pressure often feels empty instead of charged. So when writing silence, you need atmospheric reinforcement. Notice how often these chapters use lighting, ventilation hums, distant engines, sealed hatches, muted footsteps, constrained movement, sterile air, and controlled pacing. All of these environmental details reinforce silence structurally. The world itself participates in the tension. This matters because silence works best when the reader becomes aware of what isn't happening. There's no chatter, no wasted movement, no emotional release, and that absence becomes palpable only when the environment supports it. 7, I can't read. Avoid turning the system into a puzzle. I started falling into that one. This is another major pitfall. Writers sometimes unintentionally gamify communication systems. Readers start trying to solve the code instead of emotionally inhabiting the scene. Once that happens, the tension drops, the emotional immersion weakens, and the scene becomes analytical instead of experiential. The Veil system avoids this because the scenes never prioritize. Can you decode this? Instead, they prioritize. Can you feel what this is doing to the room or the people in it? That's a completely different narrative goal, and it's a much stronger one. 7. Emotional context is the real language. Whoops. Sorry. Emotional context is the real language. At the deepest level, the actual language of these scenes is not a veil code. It's emotional context. The gestures matter because the characters matter. The signals matter because fear exists, grief exists, loyalty exists, exhaustion and protection exist. Oops. Without emotional stakes, the system would collapse into mere aesthetics. This is true for all narrative systems. World building alone does not create emotional investment, the people do. So when revising your own scenes, ask yourself, if I removed the technical terminology, would the emotional movement still function? If the answer is yes, your foundation is strong. 9. Adapting these techniques across genres. These principles work far beyond military sci-fi. In fantasy, it could be magical gestures, ritual spacing, silent court etiquette, sacred movement systems. Oops, sorry. And in horror, it could be shared glance language. Oops, sorry. I'm gonna have to read from over there, it's being a pain. Oh dear. Shared glance language, avoidance behavior, tightening physical spacing. In romance, you might see it as recurring touch patterns, mirrored posture, emotional rhythm through silence. And in mystery, coded exchanges, investigative shorthand, concealed observational signals. Hello, veil code. In contemporary drama, this could mean family habits, caregiving behaviors, unspoken routines. Oops. The genre changes. The underlying principle does not. Repeated nonverbal behavior becomes emotional language over time. Let's see. 10. Here's our final applied principle. Build systems that characters forget they're using. Yeah. That's a thing. This may be the most important craft takeaway from tonight. The Veil system feels believable because the characters don't perform it consciously every second. They live inside it. The signals emerge naturally under pressure, and that natural emergence is what gives the system realism. So when building your own communication structure, aim for this. Not, look at this cool code system, but these people have relied on this so long that it has become instinct. That difference changes everything. What communication patterns in your writing have become instinctive enough that your characters would still use them even under exhaustion, fear, or grief? Ooh, that is a great question. Okay. Now that we've gotten through all of that, we're gonna slow down a little bit and go into some Q&A. Alright. So this section is really more about reflection. I'm not looking for any kind of perfect answers, just awareness. And as always, if you're listening quietly tonight, that's totally okay. A lot of people process craft internally first, especially with workshops like this, where the material sits very close to emotional pacing and behavioral subtlety, and the things stories communicate beneath the dialogue. You don't have to articulate every thought for this workshop to matter. Sometimes noticing it is enough. 1. Communication beyond dialogue. One of the things I'd like to invite people to think about is this. When your characters stop speaking, what continues communicating for them or around them? For some writers, the answer is posture. For others, it's the environment, the interruption patterns, eye contact, movement, pacing, or the silence itself. And sometimes, when we go back through our own work carefully, we realize that our stories already contain nonverbal systems. We just haven't consciously reorganized them yet. That's actually what happened to me, honestly. That's kind of how Veil Code and the haptic pulse code just kind of developed. I was needing something, you know, in the story, and it was kind of already there. I just had to make it a thing. For instance, a family might have inherited gestures, avoidance rituals, protective positioning, and a military unit might have spacing habits, shared shorthand, and silence discipline. A close friendship might communicate through timing, rhythm, and unfinished sentences. I actually do that with my siblings a lot. Okay? Have you ever been in a room with one of a really good friend or a sibling and you're like finishing each other's sentences? Yeah. That's me with my siblings. Okay? It is totally a thing. And none of that requires formal code. What matters is the consistency and the emotional meaning. 2. Silence that carries weight. Another thing worth considering is this. Does the silence in your scenes feel empty or intentional? There's a difference. And honestly, it's one of the hardest balances to learn as a writer, because silence only becomes emotionally powerful when the reader trusts the scene and the emotional stakes are already established and the environment supports the quiet in the scene. Otherwise, silence can accidentally feel like missing dialogue, pacing drag, or uncertainty from the author themselves. One of the reasons silence works so well in chapters 17 to 20 is because the surrounding structure is so controlled. The reader understands that these people are withholding speech deliberately. That intentionality changes the emotional texture of the scenes completely. So if silence in your own scenes feels flat, it may not mean that you need more dialogue. It may mean that the scene itself needs stronger environmental pressure, clearer emotional stakes, or more visible behavioral responses. We have an ad starting in about 4 minutes and 23 seconds. 3. The difference between clarity and full explanation. I was falling into the full explanation issue. Okay? I'm just gonna admit that. It's a thing. This comes up constantly in world-building heavy stories like mine, especially in sci-fi and fantasy. Writers worry, will the readers understand this? Hello? Yeah. And that concern is understandable, but clarity doesn't require complete explanation. Readers usually need 3 things. Emotional clarity. How does this moment feel? Spatial clarity. Where are the people in the scene positioned? And behavioral clarity. What are the characters actually doing in the scene? If those 3 things remain stable, the readers can tolerate a tremendous amount of partial mystery, much more than many writers actually realize. And honestly, sometimes partial understanding is better for your reader, because it creates immersion rather than observation. Readers begin feeling that they're inside the culture instead of reading a technical manual, and that's an important distinction. 4. Repetition and emotional conditioning. Another thing that I'd like you to think about: what repeated behaviors in your story are beginning to condition emotional responses from the reader? Ooh, I'm gonna read that again. What repeated behaviors in your story are beginning to condition emotional responses in your readers? Because repetition is powerful, not only narratively, but psychologically. When readers repeatedly associate a gesture, a phrase, a positioning pattern, silence, a piece of music, or a ritual action with a particular emotional state, eventually the repetition itself starts carrying emotional weight for them. That's what happens with many veil signals over time. The reader no longer consciously processes this is a recovery oversight signal. Instead, they feel someone is trying to steady the room. That emotional transition is where systems become immersive, and that's honestly what I'm working for. And it doesn't happen through explanation, it happens through repetition paired with emotional consistency. I am got a bit of a frog in my throat, sorry about that. 5. The emotional cost of structured silence. Something else worth sitting with tonight. Structured communication systems often carry a hidden emotional cost, especially systems built around suppression, restraint, or operational discipline. The veil system protects people, but it also demands compression, containment, emotional control, and delayed emotional release. And those things shape the characters psychologically over time. That tension is part of what makes the system feel human. Because if a communication system only made a character look cool or hyper competent, it would feel emotionally shallow very quickly. Instead, these scenes acknowledge fatigue, grief, strain, and the effort required to maintain discipline under pressure. That complexity keeps the silence alive emotionally. And I'm going to stop right there because we haven't added about 15 seconds. Alright, you guys. Go get yourselves a drink of water, have a stretch. I will see you back in a minute and a half. Alright, my friends, we are back from our ad break. I hope you actually took a chance to stretch or get some water. It's really important to take care of yourself. 6. Letting readers learn slowly. One thing that I'd encourage you as a writer not to be afraid of. Your readers learning slowly. That's honestly okay. Actually, it's ideal. You don't need your readers to fully understand your system immediately. You need them to trust you as the writer and to trust the emotional consistency, the narrative intention, and the behavioral logic. Understanding can gradually deepen over time. In many cases, gradual understanding creates a stronger immersion in the story because the reader begins participating actively in scene interpretation, not analytically, but emotionally. And honestly, that's part of why long-form storytelling can feel so rewarding and why I keep doing it. Readers slowly begin recognizing patterns in your stories. The way a certain character stands, the way tension tightens in silence, and the way protection changes room geometry, and the way that grief can alter movement. Those accumulated recognitions create emotional depth that short-term exposition rarely can. If you're working on something right now, especially something system heavy like Veil Code, it may help to ask yourself, am I building the system for realism alone or for emotional meaning? Because those are not always the same thing. And usually, emotional readability matters more than technical completeness. Yeah. Hello, Veil Code. The system should serve the scene. The scene should not stop serving itself in order to explain the system in the scene. That balance is one of the most difficult parts in this style of writing. And honestly, it's one of the most rewarding once it clicks into place. Here's something to end this section with. If your scenes feel subtle, that doesn't mean that they're weak. Quiet storytelling often requires more reader trust and more pacing control, as well as more emotional precision than louder scenes do, especially when working with silence, nonverbal behavior, layered emotional systems, or restrained characters. So if you're writing something quiet right now, something careful, and something built on small shifts instead of spectacle, that work still matters, and your readers do feel it, even when the story barely raises its voice. As we prepare to move into our final section tonight, consider this. What repeated silence, gesture, or positioning pattern in your story already carries emotional meaning, even if you've never formally defined it? Okay. Let's take a few minutes to begin to close things out tonight. I just want to give enough space to let the workshop settle before stepping away from it, because we've touched on a lot tonight. We covered a lot of structural ground. We talked about silent communication systems, such as haptic pulse architecture and veil signals, positioning language, and emotional layering inside doctrine, and the way that tension can move through scenes without relying heavily on spoken dialogue. But underneath all of that technical structure, the real subject tonight was trust. Trust between the characters, trust between the writer and the readers, and trust in the idea that silence can carry meaning on its own. Because ultimately, the veil system works not because the signals are complex, but because the emotional relationships surrounding them are believable. The gestures matter because the people matter. The silence matters because the stakes underneath it matter. And that's something I really want writers to carry forward from tonight. You don't need to create massive systems in order to create emotional depth in your scenes. You just need consistency, behavioral honesty, and emotional continuity, and trust in those small moments. One repeated signal, used carefully across several scenes, can become more emotionally powerful than an entire glossary of invented terminology. I'm a living example of that. Sorry. A single recurring positioning habit can quietly define a relationship. A pause before a response can communicate fear, exhaustion, grief, restraint, or even affection, depending on the context. That flexibility is what makes nonverbal storytelling come alive. And honestly, I feel that that's part of why these chapters resonate with me the way that they do. The signals aren't treated like a spectacle, they are treated like a lived behavior, an old behavior, an embedded behavior, and a behavior that surfaces under pressure because the characters no longer consciously think about it. That instinctive quality is what gives the system emotional credibility. Another thing that I hope that everyone takes away tonight is that readers don't need to consciously decode everything in order to feel that narrative tension. Often, readers are responding emotionally before they can fully articulate why. They feel the tightening corridor, the structured silence, the shift in spacing, and the protective positioning. The room compressing around grief or danger before they ever consciously identify the reason underneath it. And that's okay. Actually, it's ideal, because stories are not engineering diagrams, they're emotional experiences. For writers working with military structures, magical systems, court etiquette, ritual communication, sign language, coded interactions, or simply emotionally restrained characters, I think one of the most useful questions you can ask yourself is this: what is the system emotionally protecting? Not what information does it transmit, but what vulnerability does it hide? What fear does it manage? What trust does it require of the characters and the reader? And what grief does it contain? What intimacy does it allow? Because those answers are usually where the story actually lives. I'm gonna give you some homework. Completely optional, just some things to kind of work your writer brains. Okay. No expectation to actually do this. They're here if you want to do them. Like I said, absolutely no pressure. These are simply quiet exercises to carry forward from what we've talked about tonight if they feel useful to you. 1. The behavioral repetition pass. Choose one character in your current project. Identify one repeated movement, one repeated silence pattern, or one positioning habit, and then ask, what emotional meaning is beginning to attach itself to this behavior? 2. The silent scene exercise. Write a short scene where no one explains their feelings directly, no major exposition occurs, and tension is carried entirely through movement, spacing, pacing, environment, or interruption patterns. Focus on emotional clarity rather than technical complexity. 3. Context shift. Take one gesture or phrase from your story, place it into a moment of grief, danger, and a moment of relief. How does the emotional meaning shift while the action itself stays the same? 4. Reader trust. Revisit a scene where you explained your system heavily. Experiment with removing some of that explanation. Ask yourself, does the emotional movement still remain understandable? If it does, you may already trust the scene more than you think you do. One of the quiet truths about nonverbal storytelling is this: silence only becomes meaningful once the readers trust that something is being communicated. That trust is earned slowly through repetition, consistency, emotional honesty, and restraint. Not every story needs a formal communication doctrine, but almost every story develops some form of emotional language over time. The way certain people stand near each other, the way exhaustion changes speech, the way grief alters movement, the way protection reshapes a space. All of these things become part of narrative communication, and once writers start noticing the layers, the stories often become quieter, but much deeper. As always, thank you all for spending time in the archives tonight. I hope that the workshop tonight was helpful to you, and if you're not a writer, I hope it gave you something to think about. And I hope that my nerdiness was useful. I am still continuing to build the Veil Code and Haptic Pulse systems because I'm still working on the chapters. So I'm thankful for everyone that was here tonight, and I hope that you enjoyed our discussion. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, anything you'd like to hear more about, you can always leave questions in chat whenever I'm live, or you can pop into Discord and leave comments there. Alright, let's go say hi to someone this evening. Give me just 1 second. Okay. Let's see. You know what? We're gonna go say hi to Kala. Give me 1 second. Yeah, we're gonna go say hi to Kala. She is currently playing at Palia. So we're gonna go say hi. She is super chill. Give me 1 second. Okay. Or maybe not. Sounds. Let's see. Sorry, guys. Alright, my friends. Thank you so much for being here this evening, and I hope to see you all on Wednesday as we read chapter 22 of Steps into the Past. As a heads up, I will not be streaming on Wednesday, May 27th. I will be away and traveling, so my next stream will be after that. I'll post an update in Discord as always, and hope to see you all on Wednesday for story time. Give me just a moment while I get this sorted.